Alrighty, hi there. So we are going to be talking about Shay's Rebellion today, which was really the catalyst to the Constitutional Convention. So just as a quick background, remember that we have just signed the Declaration of Independence in 1776. 1781, we create the Articles of Confederation. Those get ratified to become our first kind of draft of a federal government. And then in 1783, we end the Revolutionary War. And so this event that we're going to be talking about happens in 1785. And so to understand this, you're going to need a little bit of context there. So the Articles of Confederation was basically our first government, like I said, and so it was a unanimous agreement between 13 states. Eventually, it's going to get replaced by the Constitution. A lot of times when I teach this to my 8th grade students, they want to know, well, where did the Articles go? If the Constitution is obviously our government now, it didn't last very long. So what happened? First off, there were a lot of problems with the Articles of Confederation. Namely, number one, the federal government was too weak. There was only one branch of government, legislative, and so there was no executive branch, meaning no president, or judicial branch, meaning courts. The other problem was that they could not collect taxes. They could not levy taxes. Now, part of that was coming from their kind of issues with King George. They did not want to become like their mother country, England. And so they decided that the federal government should not levy taxes. That should be a state responsibility. This was going to become a problem later on in the story. Another problem was that the federal government could not regulate commerce, interstate or foreign. So people were breaking trade agreements with other countries. And then there were the biggest one in the context of Shay's Rebellion was that there was no military, specifically no army at all or navy. States had their own militias of varying sizes and training abilities, but there was no federal government to help protect America. And then there was a supermajority vote required to pass laws. 9 out of 13 states had to agree for laws to get passed. All the states had to agree for amendments to get passed. So some economic context to kind of help you out here. In the rural New England colonies, subsistence farming was the norm. And so the basis of the economy was really based on bartering. Farmers bartered with one another and traded goods and services to survive. Now, that's really in direct contrast with the coastal economies of the New England colonies, in a different part of the New England colonies. And so this part was really what's called a merchant economy. It's what we traditionally think of when we think of the economy, trading currency for goods and services rather than bartering. Now, this is going to become a problem because the merchant economy the people living in these coastal economies are going to start to rule the state government. They're the ones who are going to start to get elected to state offices. And so this is going to become a problem because the state governments, who again were ruled by merchants who used cash and currency, would require taxes to be paid for in cold hard cash. Now, obviously, this is going to become a problem for those rural farmers who we just discussed. They rarely used currency. They used bartering and they were subsistence farmers. And so they're not going to have much cash to be able to pay their taxes. And so this is an image of a voucher that was used a lot like a prepaid debit card would be nowadays. They would give someone cash, and then this would be used to pay for their taxes. Now, obviously, if you haven't been able to figure this out, this is a huge problem for rural farmers. They're going to be found in a world of hurt real quick with the system because of how their economy was set up. And so this right here is actually a petition asking for the Delaware's government to reconsider the use of the system. So the beginnings of this rebellion, you have this kind of background now. Governor James Bowdoin was elected in 1785, and so he's going to start increasing taxes. Now, the reason that he actually gets elected was that the previous governor, John Hancock, same guy with the signature on the Declaration of Independence, same John Hancock, had actually resigned. And so a lot of historians actually think that he resigned, citing sickness as his reason, but actually a lot of people think that he knew kind of what was coming here and knew that he wanted to avoid that. So Governor Bowdoin increased efforts to collect taxes and really crack down on tax evasion, which is going to, again, be a very big problem for these farmers. And so he's also going to implement new taxes, including a property tax. And so this is going to be a problem. And so people are going to start to protest it with people like Job Shattuck organizing to physically stop tax collectors from collecting taxes. And these people called themselves regulators, which is a reference to the regulators of the 1760s who created an uprising in the Californias, which served as a catalyst to the Revolutionary War. So they saw themselves as like Minutemen or revolutionaries, like the people who were fighting in the revolution, fighting for their country. Now, one group of these people that were really affected by this were veterans, and that's partially because they were really poorly paid during the Revolution. And so one of those veterans was Daniel Shays, who served in the American Revolution. And when he came back from serving into his home in Massachusetts, he actually was shocked to find that he was in a huge amount of debt. He owed back taxes, and he was being sued by the government, which was insane because he was unable to pay that, considering how poorly the militiamen of the revolution were paid. So a privately funded militia is formed, and they do suppress some of the rebels, but some end up becoming a little bit more successful. About in a month and a half happens, and so this eventually leads to some protesters being arrested, but those trials were generally postponed and then adjourned because the protesters actually forced the courts in Massachusetts to shut down, so they weren't physically able to conduct court. And so this is actually a rather well-known image depicting how these protests occurred. They were very violent and physical. This picture is often seen in like history textbooks or videos about this. And so Governor Bowdoin really did not do a lot to stop this issue of the protests, other than issuing a statement condemning violence. He didn't organize a militia or plan any kind of military response. We didn't have a military to speak of for the Articles of Confederation, how that worked. And so even if he had, it wouldn't have been very successful. And eventually he did call on the militia. And so they actually refused to help him because so many of them were veterans themselves who supported the protesters. And so they actually refused to help. And so if this happened nowadays, the immediate response would be to call in the National Guard. But remember, there was no federally organized militia or military, and the state militia was obviously not going to be of much assistance. Some legislative action happened. They suspended habeas corpus, which actually made things worse because authorities were able to keep people in jail without trial. And so one of the ringleaders we mentioned earlier, Job Shattuck, actually ended up getting arrested, one of these people, and this actually fueled the fire. Rebellion ended up keeping going, and so eventually it was shut down. Thousands ended up signing confessions, essentially pleading guilty to charges of treason in exchange for amnesty. And so in the end, 18 men actually were convicted and sentenced to death. Only 2 of them were actually killed. Shays was pardoned, even though he was kind of the figurehead for all of this. And so that being said, the problem was that his reputation was absolutely smashed at this point. The press called him a terrorist. He was an unpatriotic anarchist. He eventually died alone of dysentery in 1825. This was an event that kind of caused mixed reactions. Some were worried. Thomas Jefferson actually supported the rebellion. He said that regular rebellion can actually serve to protect liberty. This is a relatively famous quote. The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It is its natural manure. So why is this important? Here's the big deal about this issue, is that it brought the issue of federal power to the forefront. We had started with King George in the mother country of England being very, very federally powerful and with a lot of influence on our taxation, not a lot of representation, not a lot of state power. And so we almost went too far in the other direction and made a very weak federal government. And so this kind of brought the issue of maybe we should have gone somewhere in the middle to the forefront of the conversation. And part of the reason Shays' Rebellion happened the way it did was because of this lack of the strong federal government. And so the taxation issue was actually could have been solved if it were not for the fact that the federal government couldn't collect taxes. The state governments were in charge of taxation. There was no president to help resolve it. There was no army to shut down the insurrection. And so already the Federalists and Anti-Federalists were starting to argue about this. And so this really became an issue of importance because of Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion was really the catalyst for calling the Constitutional Convention to order. And it actually led some people who were really staunch anti-federalists, people who were against a strong federal government, to consider the possibility of maybe a stronger federal government. And it really actually shaped our Constitution as we know it today. And so if it was not for Shays' Rebellion, we would not have the government we have today. It might have been the Constitution, but it would have looked different, and it definitely would not have happened the same way. This is my bibliography. I use several sources from scholarly sources, and then I actually found some really cool primary sources down there at the bottom from Heritage Auctions. So thank you so much for listening about Shays' Rebellion, and have a great day.